My Polish Teacher's Tie by Helen Dunmore. This is really about the forming of a relationship or potential relationship between Carla, who's a dinner lady who works in a school in England, and she's going to be visited by a teacher from Poland called Stefan, who's a pen pal. And the reason why they become pen pals is because Carla is in fact herself half Polish, although she seems to have actually really forgotten her heritage and who she is, and you know, her place, I suppose, in both in society and within the culture. So this is very much about someone whose identity seems to have been lost in some way. And the sort of two strands of the story, I suppose, that tie together are the idea of, you know, status, the way we define people by their jobs and their role in life, and also the sense of identity and being trapped between two cultures. Carla, having married, she's actually called Carla Carter, married and divorced, has one daughter, and seeming to have very little working knowledge of her Polish heritage except through what is revealed by starting this pen pal relationship with the very passionate teacher who comes to visit from Poland. Now, as a dinner lady, one of Carla's jobs is to serve tea and buns to teach in the staff room at school. During break, the head announces that Polish teachers are looking for pen friends in English schools with a view to arrange an exchange visit. And because she is half Polish, although she's forgotten all the Polish she ever knew, it becomes interesting and asks for an address to write. So it's interesting at that point that the head seems to feel almost as if it's a joke. He doesn't seem to occur to him that somebody on his ancillary staff, someone who's not a teacher, would be capable of doing this or even interested in doing it, which suggests a certain amount of snobbery, which is then taken up throughout the rest of the story, particularly by his treatment or reaction to her rather towards the end, and also Mrs. Kenwood's reaction to Carla and to the visiting teacher when he arrives. Okay, so she exchanges letters with the teacher, Stefan, who has to be called Steve. Tells him about her background and family, but she doesn't say anything about a job, which begins to cause quite a lot of problems when he announces his intention to come and visit, because she feels as if she's misled him. She's clearly aware of her lack of status within the school and that she's embarrassed and feels that he will not want to have anything to do with if she reveals what she actually does for a living. In the meantime, he's been sending her poems. He's not just a teacher who teaches, he's also a writer. There's a real passion and interest in language, and he has a real enthusiasm and life about him, which obviously she finds very pleasant and attractive. And she eventually hears he's coming to England, but he's going to stay with one of the teachers, Mrs. Kenwood, another English teacher. She's rather worried he might feel hurt that she's not invited him to stay with her, and that he will assume that she's a teacher. So there's quite a lot of conflict, which is brought by those twin ideas of her status and her lack of uncertainty about her lack of identity. Really, very clear. I say there's a lack of clarity. Sorry, about the sense of identity. Mrs. Kenwood, the English teacher who has him visit, seems to make a lot of stuff of having him, a lot of fuss about having him there, saying she finds him hard work. Her daughter has to leave the room when he's around, and seems to show no interest whatsoever in his interest in English, and his passion for poetry. And when he arrives in the staff room, he's wearing a very bright, highly coloured tie, and Carla introduces herself to him and significantly actually leaves Mrs. Kenwood and her colleagues to fend for themselves while she goes to very politely excuse herself, but she's not going to serve them. Instead, she's going to go and speak to Stefan, and he sings to him in Polish. It's a very sort of quite romantic moment in many ways that he starts to sing to, and she realises it's one of the songs her mother used to sing to, and she finds herself joining in and remembering the words, which quite surprises the headmaster, who comments that he didn't realise that she could speak Polish, having then stumbled over her name yet again, as if he doesn't pay attention to the so-called small people in his school. He's too bothered with the staff members and things like Ofsted, which he mentions earlier in the story. And when he says to her he didn't realise she was Polish, significantly she says, "No, nor did I," which obviously is an indication of how she has felt about the loss of her own heritage and her joy at now rediscovering it again with Stefan. The significance of the tie in the title is very important. I mean, tie, usually a very austere, drab, dreary symbol of authority. But when Stefan appears, it's obviously very brightly coloured, and it's described as being like a flag from another country. A better country than the ones either of us lived in. So it's not necessarily just about Poland coming in, it's something to do with life and the actual way these two together have a real kind of a passion and a connection. And the last line of the story, I like your tie, obviously isn't just simply about the tie, it's also about this whole experience that she shared. And there is an implication possibly of romance, although it's not explicit, it's rather ambiguous in some ways. So she's aware of a Polish background, she's lost touch with it. He kind of brings her back to that part of herself. And his emotions and his enthusiasm about poetry and song show that he's very different from the other English teachers. He's more open, he's spontaneous, he's more in touch with his own emotions, and really ironically has more of an appreciation for language than the other teachers that are there, particularly Mrs. Kenwood, who, although she's not exactly a villain, seems to be quite antagonistic and rather unpleasant, and says some, rather petty personal things about him, which seem to be rather harsh and unfair. Class and status are definitely a large part of the issues that are explored in this story. Carla is very conscious. She's ignored by some teachers and looked down on by others. She feels very much defined by a uniform. There's mention of the £3.89 that she works for, and the blue and white uniform, which seems rather tacky and unattractive. But of course, Steve, in spite of her worries, is not so bothered by her status, and there's this, some nice twist there that when he actually does turn up, that all her fears and all her worries are completely unfounded, and that he is just this genuine person who's accepted and is looking forward to meeting her. She appears to be a single parent with one daughter. She has been married before because she's called Mrs. Carter, but we don't really know anything about her marriage or history. Or when she writes to Steve, there's no indication she's actually looking for a romantic relationship, but there certainly is a suggestion of the possibility of that at the end of the story. And there are also hopes and expectations in the story. Carl wants something more than a life pouring tea for teachers, and this seems to be tied up again, with rediscovery of her identity and her Polish heritage. In some ways, removing her from the tyranny of her status, that she can go beyond that, and that writing to Steve is quite a bold, heroic step from her point of view. Expectations are quite low, but the way things turn out obviously is much better than she expects. In some ways, her lack of status and her lack of confidence have been so undermined that she tends to have low expectations and tends to feel that disappointment in life is more likely than the fun and the joy that she finds with this new friend. The main setting is the staff room of a school, not really described in detail. It could appear that the narrator doesn't feel you really need to describe it, just part of life, and the staff is possibly, that she's seen by the staff as possibly as part of the furniture. They don't seem to really acknowledge her, particularly the headmaster. It's almost as if she's not there. I think the staff room is represented really as quite a confined, very conventional place, and the teachers, particularly Mrs. Kenwood, and indeed the head himself, seem to be quite petty-minded, unimaginative, quite dull, conventional, possibly not very inspiring people to be teachers, I would have thought. Carla is narrating the story but doesn't really go into detail about herself. She has a daughter, she works as a dinner lady. The focus on the story is really on her lost Polish background, the heritage that she regains through her relationship, or her pen-friend relationship, I should say, with Stefan. She feels as if she's been defined by a job by other people, and kind of feels this need to break out. She worries what people might think of her, but she's actually quite bold, and she's the first to ask for the address to write to Steve, and then when she basically puts aside her duties as a dinner lady and excuses herself and goes up and directly introduces herself in the staff room, I think that clearly shows a growing confidence and a sense of self-worth in the character. Steve's real name, of course, is Stefan, but he adopts the English form of his name, reflecting his love of English and his profession. He's very enthusiastic, he writes poetry, he arrives at the school but gets a very mixed response. Carla's attracted to his eccentric dress sense, and he shows himself to be very spontaneous and without any kind of snobbery or judgment, but the other teachers don't seem to feel much of a connection with him, particularly Mrs. Kenwood. They don't take much notice of Carla either. Although she knows their names and listens to them, they don't seem to really acknowledge her or know very much about her. And Mrs. Kenwood in particular expresses several negative feelings about Steve staying at her house, and she's almost the opposite of him in some ways, almost binary opposites. Where he's very positive, she's very critical. He's broad and open, she's narrow-minded, and where she seems to be just going through the motions, doing her job as an English teacher, where he really has a love of poetry and language. The story is written in the first person. Carla is the narrator. It starts in the present tense with Carla telling the readers something about herself, but moves to the past as she tells the story, so it makes it sound like she's chatting to us. It's a sort of very conversational recount, really, so the tone is very chatty, very colloquial, informal language. It seems to be quite a light-hearted story and positive, in stark contrast to some of the other stories in the anthology. Carla does use similes to describe her reactions, such as tense as a guitar string, which again, this idea of music and expression seems to fit in with the denouement when Stefan arrives and starts singing to her, and they rediscover their heritage through song. They're quite common similes, the sort of people use in everyday conversations, and in many ways quite cliched, nothing very imaginative. Letters from Steve are also quoted. In this way the reader tends to hear his voice before he arrives and his point of view, just as Carla does. It's interesting that his English is rather stilted and formal, as you might expect from someone who's learned English abroad and knows all the structures but none of the idiomatic language or the colloquialisms. And of course, very importantly, Steve's tie becomes a symbol of his unconventionality and his positive attitude. So the description of a flag from another country suggests this might not be typical of where he lives himself. It may be even in Poland he's regarded as being a little bit of an eccentric, but certainly by the end the symbol here and the way she claims him as my Polish teacher suggests this growing confidence and self-belief in Carla, where she's embraced her own culture again and sought to rediscover it, and at the same time has realised that she's more than simply a dinner lady and can break out and beyond that status and has an equivalence with Steve, and they have enjoyed the same status. And as I say, at the end of the story there's nothing directly to suggest romance developing, but of course that is always a possibility, and the moment of meeting and the singing together in the staff room does seem like quite a romantic moment to end the story on.